Okay, we'll get started. So we'll be going over chapter 18 and maybe some of chapter 19, depending on how far we get through today. Um, Hopefully, we can get to chapter 20 before Thursday. If not, it will not be on the final. Okay, so the final will contain these last few chapters that we went over um, after chapter 27. Um, so the final should be about half new material and then half old material. Okay. And then we'll be going over a little bit of the final on Thursday. So I will be having a review session next week on Monday before I upload the final. And I'll kind of be going through what will be on the final, and um, it's worth the same as any of the exams. So 100 points. Again, half new, half old. So it will contain half of this information, half of the old information. Um, Most likely going to make it majority um, majority multiple choice. Okay, so if not all multiple choice, I haven't decided entirely yet. I'm finishing up the exam right now. I don't know if I want to put one or two free response questions at the end. It might be better to do that. We'll see. But I will say this: the old material or that from the other previous chapters that we haven't covered at the end are going to be the exact same questions that I've used before. Okay, so half of the exam will be the exact same questions that I've used before. So in order for you to study, I've decided to open up the exams once more and let you go through your old exams. Okay, so if you have any questions, um, you can let me know after going through the exams. Okay, so I also upload 5 questions that'll be again for just extra credit, and you can go through them, and then I'll have one of those on the exam. Okay, so again, all the old material that I will put on the final will be for will be previous questions I use on the other exams, the other 5 exams throughout the semester. Okay, and then half, of course, will be new, and then I'll give you a free response question if I decide to put a free response question on the exam. So I'll give you one freebie. So if I do decide to put a free response, you'll have two, but I'll give you one. Okay, and that will be on that extra credit assignment. Okay, so all of you should have signed up for presentations already. Um, and again, the schedule is here. So for today the 7th, I have George, Summer, okay, all the way down, right? So I already sent out that Zoom link for that. So please log on at about 9:40, 9:47, 9:48, and then be ready to present, okay? And then Summer, just be sure to log on at 10:17 at the latest, okay? So these are the presentations for the end of the semester. No one else has emailed me or talked about um, scheduling a time. So if you haven't scheduled a time, uh, looks like you're out of luck. Okay, you're just not going to get those points now. All right, well, we'll get started. All right, an introduction of ecology. Okay, so this is chapter 18. So what is ecology? Ecology is a scientific study of the interactions between organisms and their environments. Okay, so essentially what we're talking about here is just how organisms in their natural environments react to situations. Okay, and there are various things that can occur in an environment, and there's abiotic and biotic factors. So abiotic meaning things that are not of living origin, right? So we're talking about nutrients in the soil for plants. We're talking about volcano eruption. We're talking about sun exposure, right? We're talking about weather patterns. Those are going to be abiotic factors. Whereas biotic factors are going to be an introduction of an invasive species. It's going to be a new predator or a predator changing its hunting habit. So other prey are going to be affected by that, right? There can be multiple things that are biotic versus abiotic, and we'll go through some of them throughout these next few lectures. But Ecology essentially, um, again, we're just looking at the organisms surviving in their environments, right? It can also even be in the microscopic realm. Okay, so looking at bacteria that are surviving in an individual's gut, right? We're looking at those different factors that are controlling that and how those organisms can manipulate or change, given various other things that could occur, like diet change of that host, or antibiotics being given to the host. Right? There's a lot of different things that can change. Okay. So, so discovery science in a rainforest canopy. So this is an individual studying what it looks like are different plants that are living on high canopy environments in the rainforest, right? So a biologist can they're collecting insects rather, sorry. So a biologist collects insects in a rainforest on the eastern slope of the Andes mountain range in Argentina. I mean, it says he's collecting bugs. It looks like he's collecting plants. So he's taking a survey of those insects there in that rainforest canopy, right? He's trying to see what is growing there, how they're growing there, what potential environmental niches are they exploiting, right? So he's just figuring out or trying to find out what type of organisms do survive in the canopy, right? So a lot of things can affect um, an environment, right? So here we have a human impact on the environment, right? This is going to be an oil spill off the Gulf of Mexico. So this was a deep horizon disaster in 2010, right? This was made a bunch of newscasts where the company uh, had a incident where they dumped millions of gallons of crude oil, right? Which is terrible. Okay, so remember, oil is non-polar, so it sits on the surface of the ocean water. Okay, so any bird or any fish that comes in contact with that oil can be soaked, and it can biologically be an issue. Okay, and environmentally be an issue. Okay, so humans definitely have an impact on the environment, which we'll talk about throughout these next few chapters, right? Especially with global warming, carbon emissions, things like that. Okay. All right, a hierarchy of interaction. So, what factors affect an ecosystem? We have biotic factors, which is a living component of a biological community, any organism that is part of an individual's environment, right? So, right, we talked about predators. Maybe we're talking about prey, right? Let's say there's predators. We're going to look at how the prey can affect the predators growing in that environment, okay? Let's say the prey, such as a rabbit or a squirrel, become ill, right? They have some sort of biological issue. Okay, let's say there's an infection or virus that goes through a population of prey for the predator, then the predator numbers will go down, right? Because the predator numbers depend on the prey numbers. So if something goes through and wipes out all the rabbits for the foxes, then you lose a huge component of that environment, and therefore you see that those effects upstream, right? Or let's say the grass in that environment starts to deteriorate due to some sort of fungal infection, right? Then the rabbits will stop feeding because there's not grass. The grass is being, destroyed, and then therefore the predators will not be able to consume any of the prey because the prey are already dying from the lack of a food source. So those are going to be abiotic factors, right? They're going to be dependent on the biological aspect of that environment. Okay. So abiotic factors, a non-living component of an ecosystem such as air, water, light, minerals, or temperature. Okay. Um, and these can be natural disaster events. Okay. So weather events, tornadoes, even um, eruptions. Okay. So think of Hawaii. There are volcanoes there. There's volcanoes actually different locations around Earth. Yellowstone with an eruption or the hot springs, right? Those can determine what types of organisms survive in that environment. Okay. Habitat. This is a place where an organism lives, a specific environment in which an organism lives in. Okay, so this is just an area where those organisms kind of reside and hunt or eat or live. Okay, so habitat. All right, the study of ecology. So there are four different depths of study within ecology, right? There's an organismal study, population ecology, community ecology, and ecosystem ecology. And what you see here is that the hierarchy is getting more and more complex, right? So at the organismal level, we're looking at one single aspect of that ecological system, right? We're looking at the organism. Okay, there's really nothing else that we're looking at in terms of what is causing issues or what is causing or what that organism's niche is in that environment, right? Whereas we go up, we look at a larger group of organisms as a population. So multiple organisms kind of interacting with each other. Um, and it's from the same species. Whereas community, we're looking at even a larger group of individuals rather than just a single small population, but an actual whole ecological community. Okay. And then we have an ecosystem, which is multiple different types of species and biotic and abiotic factors working together. So um, this is getting more and more complex. Think of this as a pyramid where the organismal level, it's the least complex. And then you go down to the ecosystem where you look at multiple different facets or multiple different things that contribute to that specific ecology there. Okay. Right. So the organismal, so the study of evolutionary adaptations that enable individual organisms to meet the challenges posed by their abiotic environments. So we have organismal ecology. What range of temperature can a red salamander tolerate? Right. So this is definitely going to be very specific to one specific species of organism, and this is going to be the salamander. Right. So remember, salamanders are um, going to be heavily dependent on temperature switches and changes, right? Um, so again, looking organismal ecology is looking at individual specific organisms in their ecological niche, okay, and what they're able to do or how they're able to survive in that environment, okay? Population ecology, so the study of how members of a population interact with their environment, focusing on factors that influence population density and growth, okay? So again, what factors affect the survival of emperor penguin chicks, right? So there could be multiple things, right? It could be food source at the poles, right, or at that area where these birds live. It could be whether or not there's two parents that are raising that chick, right? Because one parent will leave to go eat or go collect food, and the other stays to keep that egg warm. Vice versa, right? The roles switch once the chick hatches. Um, so there's a lot of different uh, things at the population level that you could study. Okay. Community ecology, the study of how interactions between species affect community structure and organization. So, how do predators such as this beech marten affect the diversity of rodents in a community, right? So, we're looking at multiple different species of organisms, okay? And we're looking at how they play off of each other, right? So, is there a preference between um, these types of organisms and what they select to consume, right? Maybe there are certain types of predator or certain types of prey options. They're not going to be there at certain times of the year. So how are they going to curb or affect the prey in that community, right? So in community ecology, you look at multiple different species, predator, prey, uh, um, even food resources such as plants, how it affects the prey options as well, or those smaller species in that specific habitat. Okay, so in ecosystem ecology, excuse me, this is a study of energy flow and the cycling of chemicals among the various biotic and abiotic factors in an ecosystem. Okay, so an example: what processes recycle vital chemicals, elements such as nitrogen within the savanna ecosystem in Africa, right? What types of microorganisms can affect the health of these various different mammals, right? So you can look at what types of nutrients are going to be in the runoff of the water, what types of bacteria are going to be present there, whether or not certain types of nutrients are going to be needed to support the life, especially in these trees. There can be a lot of different things that you can look at in terms of ecosystem ecology. Okay, excuse me. So abiotic factors of the biosphere. So biosphere is a global ecosystem, the entire portion of Earth inhabited by life, all of life and where it lives. Okay, so biosphere is the world, is essentially the Earth, right, and the world, right? You look at it at its entirety. That is a biosphere, um, or the biosphere, I should say, because we haven't really found anywhere else in the universe that has life, right? So life depends on pathways that transform energy and matter. Okay, so think of the key transformative pathways that we talked about in biology this semester, right? We talked about photosynthesis and respiration. And remember, the inverse of photosynthesis and respiration are just the same chemical processes, right? So one process, right, C6H12O6, right, that's going to be the glucose broken down into CO2 and water the energy, right? Where if you flip it, you have CO2, water, and then energy, ATP from the sun is required to make the glucose molecules, right? So this is the most basic of the biochemical pathways that we've talked about. But again, life depends on those very basic metabolic pathways in order to survive. Okay, so those abiotic factors in the biosphere are really crucial for survival on Earth, right? We can talk about reptiles and amphibians or frogs surviving cold and hot environments, even though they're unable to heat their own bodies, right? Or we can talk about how organisms are able to survive very different temperature ranges, but in reality, in our biosphere, for the most part, the temperature range doesn't deviate too much in comparison to temperatures that deviate in other parts of our galaxy, right? If you look at the conditions on Mars, they're going to be much colder than what you see on Earth, right? Or Mercury or Venus, right? You see those planets have very, very different types of temperature ranges where either they're scorching hot or they're very, 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 very cold. Okay. So in terms of the biosphere and what energy pathways that we have here on Earth, we're pretty spoiled. It's pretty perfect here, right? This is why we have life in almost every crevice of our Earth. Okay. So remember that. So distribution of life in the biosphere. In this image of Earth, colors are key to relative abundance of chlorophyll, which correlates with regional densities of photosynthetic organisms, right? So one of the main things that we talked about is photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the base of all life on Earth, right? We have, well, for the most part, there's exceptions like deep ocean vents and let's say the hot springs of Yellowstone, right? There's life that can be supported there regardless of whether or not the sun exists. Okay. Excuse me. But other than those few very, very, very small exceptions, life is dependent on the sun's energy. Okay. And um, one of the key organisms that we see are plankton and the base of the base organisms that produce or that are photosynthetic, right? So the majority of Earth is supported. Well, yeah, I would say that the majority of Earth is supported by organisms that are that are photosynthetic, that are able to perform photosynthesis, right? They are literally able to grab carbon, CO2 from their environments and turn that into sugar with use of the sun's energy. Okay. And that is the base of everything. That is the base of all life pretty much on Earth. Okay. So you see here, um, you have areas of high photosynthetic activity, right? And you see the different belt lines across the Earth. You'll notice here that the majority of the United States is pretty much desert. Same thing with Africa, right? Huge portions, and what you might not think of is desert is the the northern and the southern hemispheres along this belt, especially like Australia and here, right? These areas are fairly cold, but again, they do have forests, they do have wood, but for the most part, for a portion of the year, it's very cold, so you really don't have a lot of photosynthetic activity from those northern forests. Okay, they're great and they're vast, but again, the amount of photosynthesis that occurs in the rainforest and the equator line right, is immense. Okay. Um, there is a huge amount, and even more found in the ocean. Okay, with chlorophyll and plankton, right, or the chlorophyll containing plankton. Temperature. So temperature is an important abiotic factor that affects metabolism. There are ectotherms like reptiles, right? They do not have the ability to control their temperature. They rely on the environment, right? Ecto, think outside temperature affects them. And then endotherms, which are mammals, right? So their inside temperature is not affected by the outside. They can thermoregulate, right? That must live in their optimal conditions. But still, we do have those very, very minute temperature ranges that we can survive in, right? We can survive in temperatures up to 100 degrees, 150 or 120 degrees Fahrenheit, right? But we would prefer to live in an area where it's 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. Same thing with other organisms. There are optimal temperatures that we can survive in, but we can still deviate outside of that range and be fine. Okay, we can thermoregulate. So organisms must maintain their body temperature and respond to changes, which is important, right? Organisms can perform different things in order to compensate for this, either internal regulation, or they can have learned behaviors where they can control that, like humans putting on a jacket, or bears hibernating during the winter when there's no food and it's too cold for them to forage, right? So there are different mechanisms, there are different ways, um, evolutionarily speaking, where we can change our responses to the environment. Okay. So this is a deep sea hydrothermal vent, right? So black smokers in the Pacific Ocean west of Washington spew plumes of hot gases from Earth's interior. Giant tube worms, which are insects shown here, or well here, um, annelids that may grow up to 2 meters long, are members of the vent community, right? And these organisms do survive off the energy produced by the internal combustion of the Earth. Okay. Ooh, excuse me. So all these little worms, well, they're actually not little; they're 2 meters long. All these worms are surviving off the heat and the chemicals that are being released by the center of the Earth, right? These organisms are not relying on um, the energy from the sun to warm them. They also can survive with the chemicals in the water, as well as the different particulates of food that are also coming down and utilizing the heat source, as well as the energy coming from the plumes. Okay, so these are one of the few organisms that do not depend on the sun. Okay, in American pica, this is diminutive relative or distant relative of rabbits, live in high elevations in the United States and Western Canada. Okay, these organisms will regulate their body temperature by going underground or outside of the ground. They also live in the desert too. So one thing about deserts is that at night it gets really cold. Okay, so if you've ever been to the Sonoran Desert or even Vegas for that matter, I think a lot of people have gone to Vegas. Um, Even during the summer, it can get quite cold, but especially if you go during the winter or even during springtime, right? It can be 90 degrees, 90 above 90 degrees, and during the day, but at night it can dip below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And that's just the high desert environments, right? And this organism um, has thermal regulation, thermal regulative adaptations and reactions to their environment, where either during the day it's too hot, they'll go underground, or at night it's also too cold, so they can forage and find a den where they can hide out. So um, this is very important for organisms to survive. Okay, water. So water is essential for life. So think water fresh is usually a limited resource in most environments. So fresh water, I think, is less than 2% or less than a percentage of the water found on Earth. Oh, what is it? I didn't have it in the book. I'm sorry, I gotta know now. I just watched something on fresh water too. Boom, can't type. 2.5%. So yeah, around 2%. Okay. Um, which is not that much. Okay. So almost the majority of all the water on, or the majority of the water on Earth is not fresh, right? It's salted. Therefore, it's not able to be utilized by biological systems, right? We need to have the proper water saline concentration in order to use that water, okay? Um, so sea fish and mammals have unique ways of controlling their water levels, right? Um, so think of sea fish, right? Or think of freshwater fish. So freshwater fish, uh, they need to constantly urinate, okay, which is weird. You don't think of fish peeing, but fish do pee, okay? Freshwater fish do pee, okay? Where they need to expel the amount of water that they're taking in because again, think of their bodies are going to be hypertonic to their hypotonic environment, right? The water is always going to be going in those fish, right? Freshwater fish. Whereas sea fish have a different dilemma, right? Their dilemma is that they're in environments that are constantly hypertonic. So in that environment, they're constantly being dehydrated, right? So remember that first, I think it was the first couple of weeks. I talked about drowning in a freshwater pool versus drowning in a saltwater or the ocean. Okay, it's much more beneficial to drown in salt water than it is to drown in fresh water because in fresh water, inhaling of the water will cause the tissues in your lung to pop, right? Because of your body being hypertonic. Well, in these different water environments, right? Freshwater fish have a dilemma of constantly urinating. They're constantly being filled or diluted, whereas seawater fish are constantly being concentrated in terms of their solutes, right? The salt water is going to be pulling their fresh water from their bodies away. Okay. So there's more salt in the ocean for those fish, right? Mammals are the same thing, right? Those sea lions are constantly in a dehydrating environment. Think of the ocean as a desert, right? It's constantly sucking the dry those organisms that are present there. So sea mammals actually do not drink seawater to gain their water. What they do is they actually consume the fish or other organisms in their environment, and that consumption of those organisms will give them the water they need to survive. Because again, they are in a dehydrating environment, and it's difficult. Okay, they need to constantly sea fish are a little different. They'll drink, right, and they have different metabolic pathways to desalinate that water in order to get their water concentrations up in their body. Okay, fresh water, whereas the mammals need to consume fish and other types of sea creatures in order to gain their water, right? Because they cannot drink that salt water. Okay. So land animals also have special processes and architecture to control water loss, right? So we talked about kidneys, right? Where kidneys need to dehydrate the amount of liquid leaving their body, right? Where we release our urine, right? We release urea. Well, reptiles actually and birds have a very, very special way of urinating. They release uric acid rather than urea based urine, right? Because urea requires a little more water. Their expulsion methods are a little more efficient, where they do not waste as much water as mammals do. But there are certain types of mammals that have longer, what are called longer loops of Henle, and those are desert mammals, right? Where they urinate a very, very concentrated type of urine, where it's almost like a paste. We're not as efficient, right? We do not produce paste when we urinate. I mean, unless you're very, very dehydrated, right? But that's, you know, rare occasions, hopefully, for most people. But certain animals, that's a normality for them. Certain mammals, they do have very, very efficient kidneys, much more efficient than ours, where they save as much water as possible. Okay. So scales on a Carolina antelope lizard. Again, these scales are going to prevent dehydration as well. Reptiles and birds. So reptiles are actually technically birds. Um, do you have mechanisms to prevent dehydration? Right. One of the mechanisms is that when their waste products from their kidneys are actually going to be concentrated into uric acid, so it almost comes out like a paste. And they also have this type of skin here, where it is very difficult to lose water through their tissues. Okay, where salamanders and other amphibians actually have wet skin, so it's very easy to dehydrate those critters in comparison to reptiles. Okay. So you see the beaded water drops. This plant has something called a cuticle. Again, this cuticle is that waxy coat on the outside of that plant. And sometimes you'll feel this on plants, right? There's some plants that are desert plants or some plants that are uh, um, used to very dry environments. And you can look at the plant and see the plant and feel the plant. And sometimes individuals think the plant is actually fake because of how waxy the outside of that leaf is, right? But here it's demonstrated this is alive and well, but the water beads and it almost feels plastic because of the amount of oil or the amount of wax that is secreted through that plant. Okay, in order to prevent that plant from drying or desiccating, right? We also talked about cacti, and other types of organisms, plants that will perform the dark reactions at a different time of the day, right? At night. So during the day, they can have all their photosynthetic processes, but they won't open their stoma until the night when the temperature drops and the sun isn't as uh, uh, drying and heating as during the day. Okay. So the evolutionary adaptations of organisms, environmental changes, abiotic or biotic and abiotic can affect evolution, right? We talked a little bit about those different processes. After a period of lower than average rainfall, drought-resistant individuals may be more prevalent in a plant population, an example of evolution, right? So think of this, the abiotic factor here is the rainfall can affect the plant outcome in that environment, okay? So having drought resistant plants after successive years of lower than average rainfall is going to force evolution, right? It's going to push on the, it's going to err on the, or push on the side of evolution to have more drought resistant plants present in that environment, okay? Which would make sense, right? Not as much rainfall, the plants that are resistant to drought are going to survive, whereas all the other plants are going to dry up and die. Okay. In addition of more predators or changes in hunting practices can also drive evolution. So bears waking up early from hibernation can change wolf population. So this is actually a thing that occurred in Yellowstone, right? Where the wolves came back and started killing prey or predators because the wolves will hunt through the winter and they'll track elk or deer in Yellowstone, right? Well, the wolves were hunted to near extinction, right, at a portion uh, during the early years of settling in the United States, right? So there was a lot of wolf populations that declined substantially because wolves are very good hunters and they liked bovine or cow meat, right? So they definitely will hunt um, the stocks of cows in the United States. Um, so they were hunted, right, to near extinction. Well, the wolves were introduced back to Yellowstone, and what happened was the bears changed their foraging patterns, right? The bears stopped hibernating during the winter, right? Because the food source was there. And what was happening is the wolves would go and they'd kill an elk or two, and the bears would just wait for the wolves to kill again because the wolves are much more efficient at hunting than the bears were. So they would kill this elk, and then the bears would come over and bully the wolves away from the carcass, and the bears would consume that carcass after. Okay, um, so the bears didn't have a reason to fall asleep during the winter. They can continually eat through the winter and be just fine. Okay, which was interesting. It was a change. It was a biotic factor that changed that introduction of new predators during the winter allowed for the bears to survive to survive and forage year round even through the winter instead of hibernating. Okay, so physiological responses, right? So here we have a mourning dove demonstrating its physiological response to cold weather. So here you have the fluffing of the feathers, right? A physiological response to environmental change. So an abiotic factor in our environment would be something like shivering as well in humans or mammals, right? Warming our bodies through the contraction of our muscles would be a physiological response. Okay, so acclimation is considered a physiological response. This is a physiological adjustment that occurs gradually through though still reversibly in response to environmental change, right? So if we get very cold, we start to shiver, right? The shivering is the contraction of the muscles in order to create heat in our body, right? Same thing with this mourning dove. um, fluffing its feathers up to create surface area. Think of this as almost like a puff jacket, heating or warming the air between the feathers and the body of that bird will allow the bird to stay warm, right? So physiological changes, right? A kick up in our metabolism to allow for higher body temperatures to survive in colder environments is also something. Okay. So the number of lizard species in different regions of the continuous United States. So notice that there are fewer and fewer lizard species in the more northern regions. This reflects lizards' ectothermic physiology, which depends on environmental heat for keeping the body warm enough for the animal to be active. Okay, so here you have multiple different lizard species. As you move up into the northern United States, you have less and less, right? And here in Maine, you almost have zero. Okay. Um, and again, lizards being ectotherms, they cannot thermoregulate their own body. They can thermoregulate their own body temperature by use of the sun and the environment, but they are unable to produce their own heat. So it becomes very difficult to thermoregulate in colder environments. Okay. Um, but a physiological change here is these organisms are required, or since they're unable to compensate for the lack of heat in the northern areas, they must survive or live in these southern areas where it's constantly going to be hot year round. Okay, whereas you still have very very cold environments during the winter, but here in these northern areas it's much colder. Right, it becomes very difficult to find areas for these lizards to hide out during the winter months, right? Because it can get too cold. So anatomical responses. So here we have the Arctic fox in winter and summer. So there's two different coats. These anatomical responses are going to be changed or seen in fur color, right? The adaptation for winter is shown here, and then the adaptation in summer, again in the summer coat, is to blend into its environment. Okay, so anatomical responses to abiotic factors in their environment. Okay, so this is especially for camouflage. Okay. Um, so wind is an abiotic factor. It shapes trees. So the mechanical disturbance of the prevailing wind hinders limb growth on the windward side of this fir tree near the Rocky Mountains, right? While limbs on the other side grow normally, this anatomical response is an evolutionary adaptation that reduces the number of limbs that are broken during strong winds. Okay. So another thing as well is think of palm trees. So an anatomical response of palm trees is that they grow very, very fibrous trunks, right? Very thin fibrous trunks. Okay. And palm trees are able to respond to high wind environments as well. Okay. So they're able to bend. And I don't know if you've ever seen images of palm trees bent during a hurricane, but these trees do not snap. Whereas you come to Fresno or you come to Tulare or Visalia counties, and if we have high advisories, we notice that there's trees and limbs everywhere, right? These trees are not these trees have not grown or developed in high wind environments, whereas you see higher wind environments in the southern states where hurricanes are more prevalent, right? Um, Here, no, trees limbs snap off. So behavioral responses. So behavioral responses have expanded the geographic range of humans. So think of weather um, uh, 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 changes, right? And humans responding to those weather change, which is adding more coats or adding or dressing for the occasion, the environment. Okay, um, and behavioral responses are true for other types of species as well, right? So think of organisms that respond to changes in their environment, right? Going outside to sunbathe or going into their den during extremely hot environments. Okay. Um, responding to the weather changes is again a behavioral response, and there's other animals that respond differently, right? Another behavioral response could be primates using tools. Okay, so we use tools as well. There's other primates that can use a stick to grab termites or grab insects and new foraging sources, right? So those are all behavioral responses. All right, climate change. So the greenhouse effect. So the warming of the atmosphere caused by CO2 and methane gas and other gases as well that absorb heat radiation and slow its escape from Earth's surface. Okay. Um, Greenhouse gases. So these are any of the gases in the atmosphere that absorb heat radiation, including CO2, methane, water vapor, and synthetic chlorofluorocarbons, which are found in aerosol cans. Okay. So think of hairspray, things like that. Okay. The average global temperature has increased to about 2 degrees since 1900. Further increases have been predicted to about 2 to 4.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Okay. Um, and 2 degrees does not sound like a lot, right? So there are, individuals that say, well, there's no way that we're doing this much damage to the environment. There's no way. Um, but in reality, we look at the amount of species that have um, entered the endangered species list or that have completely gone extinct, right? We may think otherwise, as well as the actual loss of ice in the northern and southern poles, right? Where the majority of the fresh water is locked up in those giant icebergs in the northern hemisphere, right? And that took years and years to make, and years to reside there. And now we're seeing less and less um, ice forming in the northern and southern hemispheres, and this is very alarming, right? These are trends that we've never seen before. We're losing ice at an alarming rate, and we're also losing um, uh, uh, coastline too. We can see the rise in the ocean from the loss of the fresh water that are locked up in the southern and northern poles. And again, I know that 2 degrees does not sound like a lot, but it's enough to cause a significant change in our global temperature environment, right? And I know that there's individuals that always say like, "Wow, this global warming is going on," because we look at our temperature ranges and our our temperature changes in the Central Valley, and we can see that there are differences um, from 20 to 30 years ago, right? Even especially if we look back even further, 100 or 50 to 100 years ago, there have been changes in the average temperature, right? Where we're constantly breaking records. We're constantly having, uh, um, you know, either very cold days in comparison to previously, which is also thought to be a contributor to global warming, right? Very cold winters and very hot summers, and longer, hotter summers as well. Okay, so on average, the world is becoming more and more hot or more or warm. Okay, um, and this is quite alarming. Okay, the average amount of CO2 also is raising. Okay, so here's the greenhouse effect, right? So we talked about methane as well as CO2. So methane is actually the gas that you have in your stove if you have a gas stove at home, right? That will be methane, and methane is actually good to burn. We want to burn methane off. We do not want to release methane into the atmosphere because methane is actually 25 times more uh, um, effective as a greenhouse gas than CO2. So methane is good to burn essentially because methane will burn out as carbon dioxide, right? And it becomes less likely to cause or absorb the rays from the sun. Okay. So the greenhouse effect is the sunlight comes in and the UV radiation comes, or the radiation from the sun comes and actually gets absorbed by the CO2 or the gases that are found in our atmosphere. Right? So it comes in, let's say the radiation bounces off, stopped or trapped by the greenhouse gases, and that radiation comes and gets redirected back to Earth. And essentially, you're heating the Earth in this way. Okay. So whereas before, a lot of the energy would escape, right, as a reflective energy, right? Some areas would absorb that UV radiation more than others, and then but now with the greenhouse gases at a high, very high concentrations in the atmosphere, right? More CO2, more methane gas in the atmosphere. We have the reversion or the redirection of the radiation back to Earth. Okay, so you have the radiation coming, it should reflect off, but those greenhouse gases prevent the reflection of the radiation um, off the Earth, and it redirects it back. Okay. All right, so differences in average temperature from 2006 to 2016 compared with long-term averages during 1951 and 1980 in Celsius, right? So we see hotter temperatures um, increasing, especially look at the poles. For over 40 degrees on average are much higher. Okay. Whereas here, okay, California, where we're at Central Valley, it looks like it's increased by 2 degrees Celsius on average, right? So these are very, very hot, much hotter temperatures found throughout the earth. Okay, which is scary, especially at the North Pole, where we do have all of that fresh water locked up in icebergs, at the very, very top, glaciers. Okay, accumulation of greenhouse gases, right? So CO2 is a dominant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, despite methane having 25 times the global warming potential. Okay, for 650,000 years, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 did not exceed 300 parts per million, which is crazy, right? 300 parts per million. But when you compare it today, we are at 404 parts per million, right? And that was in 2016. So we've definitely burned 4 more years worth of CO2 off into the environment, and methane. Think of cows producing that much more methane. Beef industry is also increased as well. And that produces more methane. Cows burp and fart a lot of CH4 methane gas. Okay. So look at this. The concentration of CO2 before the Industrial Revolution was 280 parts per million, right? And this was a few hundred, 100, 200 years ago, let's say. Okay. And we're almost a third to two-thirds more carbon dioxide are found in the environment, right? A little about a third more is found in the environment now, which is insane. Okay. Right? This is a huge number of CO2 in comparison to pre-industrial revolution, right? And we can attribute a lot of this to burning of fossil fuels, right? You're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through the burning of these fossil fuels, right? Okay. Atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. So notice the concentration was relatively stable until the Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 1700s in Europe, right, in England. So we do have again normality with the carbon curve, and then you have just this increasing increase, right? So one thing that'll be interesting is actually looking at the carbon curve or the carbon dioxide concentration when you see global warming or a global or when you see the effects of COVID rather. So less people are driving, less people are on the road, and it'll be interesting to see how that carbon dioxide has deviated a bit, right? And you'll really be able to tell if humans are the main contributing factor to the increase of carbon dioxide, which everyone has predicted. Yes, almost to proving the point that yeah, humans are the ones that are producing all this extra carbon dioxide. Okay, right? So how carbon dioxide enters and leaves the atmosphere. So we have photosynthesis being pulled and using the carbon, right? Photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide. So more photosynthesis, the less CO2 that we have in our environment. Okay. Respiration gives off carbon dioxide. So we respire as humans or as heterotrophic organisms. Right, we consume and then we off gas CO2 through normal metabolic processes, and then we have the combustion of fossil fuels, right? So burning of coal, burning of oil, right? So we have oil, coal, and we have the release back into the atmosphere. The ocean also absorbs a lot of CO2, which is actually not good. We do not want the ocean to help regulate the carbon in the atmosphere, right? And people might ask why. Well, carbon dioxide being pushed into water actually forms carbonic acid. Okay. One of the experiments that we used to have our students do is actually take a straw and blow in water. And what happens is they take a deep breath, they blow in water. They're introducing the carbon dioxide into the water. What happens is we actually add an indicator to the water um, where the indicator turns yellow when in presence of acid. Okay, so if they blow long enough into the water, right, blow bubbles into that water, you actually form carbonic acid, okay, which is acidic. It's not good. You don't want that. It changes the pH of the ocean, okay. Increased CO2 changes the pH of the ocean, makes it more acidic. Think of the shellfish that are surviving in that ocean. They're actually deteriorating their shells. Think of the uh, the reefs that are being deteriorated as well, right? So one of the big things associated with global warming is coral bleaching, okay, which coral reefs are considered the rainforest of the ocean, right? They are regulating the amount of carbon, they're regulating the amount of life, the diversity that's present in the ocean, right? And coral bleaching is going on because of the acidification, because of how warm and how high the sea level has changed, right? There's a lot of different factors from global warming that are contributing to the loss of our coral reefs, right? So San Bernardino County, so this is actually in California, right? Close to LA, showing the fires that have been raging. I mean, this year we had a bunch of fires as well. And we have record number of fires that are occurring in California because we are in a drought technically, right? We had about a year of rain, and then we're back into this drought, which is has been going on in California for a couple decades now, right? And this can be attributed. People think the weather patterns and weather changes can be attributed to global warming. Okay. So pines infested with bark beetles in British Columbia, Canada. We also have bark beetles in California now. If you look at the foothills, there's a lot of dying and dead pine trees. So brown or reddish foliage indicates dying of trees. Green trees are still healthy. So the change in weather conditions, so warmer conditions, allow for these bugs to survive for much longer periods of time. Okay. So the lack of a very, very cold winter prevents these organisms from dying, and then allows them to continue to infect these trees and kill these trees. Okay. All right. And I think I'm going to stop here for today. Okay. Any questions? No? Okay. Well, I don't know if I'll have this up before the presentations, but hopefully everyone knows they have a presentation or what time they have a presentation at. If not, you can look at that file. Okay. Oops. That file. Okay, so presentation times. So December 7th. So check and see if you have a presentation scheduled. I extended the time slot, so you have two more at the end. Okay, that I'll stay on. So this is extra time, just to make sure that we get everyone. Okay, that is trying to present. Okay, if you do not present, you don't reach out to me. Tough noogies, you lose a chunk of points. Okay, so I'm sorry. I've been trying to communicate with you for a couple of weeks and trying to hound you. I've posted a lot of announcements multiple times on Canvas, right? So if you didn't see it by now, then I don't know what to tell you. I don't know where you've been. So please make sure that you are registering or signing up as well. Okay. Um, all right, and that's it for today for the lecture. So I'll be lecturing again. Actually, I'm going to be lecturing tomorrow again. Okay, and I'll be getting through chapter 19, and then I'll be getting through chapter 20 on Wednesday. Okay.